When you give people feedback, you should strive to be situational and not dispositional. It's easy to be dispositional, and by dispositional I mean labeling people's behavior, extrapolating a trend where there might have only been a single occurrence of something. Situational is when you describe the situation that you're giving feedback about, and you're very specific about what you observed, and you're providing evidence for the conclusions you're coming to. Let's take a look at some situational and dispositional statements about the same situation, and let's look at what they look like as a dispositional statement and what they look like as a situational statement. A great thing we could pick at right here is the handwriting I have on this diagram. Somebody might not like this handwriting, and they might tell me that my handwriting looks horrible. In fact, I kind of feel that way about this diagram. So somebody might tell me that my handwriting is horrible. And that would be a rather dispositional statement. It's dispositional because I don't know if they're just referring to the handwriting that's on this board on this diagram, or if they're talking about my handwriting in everything that I do. So this highlights one of the problems with a dispositional assessment, and that's that it doesn't help the person that receives the feedback understand specifically what went wrong. Somebody said that my handwriting looks horrible, but I don't know why they're exactly saying that. I don't know upon what standard they're basing that statement. Now, if somebody had a problem reading my handwriting, and instead they told me that my handwriting was hard to read, that would be more specific. And it would be even better if that person went another step and told me where my handwriting was hard to read at, gave me a specific example. So in this diagram could be a little bit of a clarification. By highlighting the specifics of the situation, as the recipient, I have the ability now to understand what they mean when they say that my handwriting's horrible. They really didn't mean horrible, they meant that it's hard to read. There's quite a bit of difference between those two statements. In fact, now that I know that it's hard to read, I could probably do something about it. Now, if this were the type of feedback you're giving somebody, one thing you could do to improve it would be to include a bit of advice about how the person could go about correcting for what you perceive to be a problem. So in this case, where my handwriting is hard to read, well, I'm not probably going to improve my handwriting anytime soon, but perhaps I could write in uppercase. When people write in uppercase, it tends to be a little more legible because they need to take a little bit more time to do it. So instead of situational in the diagram like that, I could use caps instead. So when you give people feedback, you could include a little bit of advice. Try using uppercase. Adding a little bit of advice like this is really helpful. Not only have you clarified the situation, but you've given some advice about how to fix it in this specific situation. I'm no longer thinking that I have horrible handwriting all the time. I'm thinking instead how I can improve my handwriting just in this specific situation. One of the reasons that dispositional feedback is so troublesome is that it tends to label my behavior as always being horrible. So I always have horrible handwriting. If I think that, I think less of myself then. However, if you're situational, it's much harder for me to extrapolate this particular situation where you've given me good details about what I'm doing wrong. It's much more difficult for me to extrapolate that into the word horrible. In fact, it's quite a leap to jump to the word horrible, and I'm probably not going to do it myself. Giving this type of feedback applies to positive feedback as well. For example, let's say your spouse comes to you and they've taken a new photograph and they ask you for your opinion about the photograph. So let's say they've shown you this new photograph they took of New York City and they're asking you what you think about it. If you were to come back with a simple statement like, wow, I really like that photo, while that's encouraging, it doesn't give them much information about what it is that you like about the photo. So even though you say, that's great, or awesome job, and it's encouraging to say that, it doesn't help them reproduce what it is about that photo that you like. For example, in this photo, perhaps I could step back, and when I think about whether or not I like this photo, and I look at it, I could say something, I really like the lens you used here. It really captures the curvature of the Earth, which captures the essence of how big this city actually is. Whereas perhaps on a day-to-day basis in the city of New York, when you're walking through the streets, you don't always notice how big the city is because all you can see are the buildings that are nearby. So I could say something more specific about the photo to give them information that would help them reproduce that photo in the future, or reproduce photos like it using the same techniques, which will also be photos I like, and perhaps other people will like as well. And I can do that by being situational. So I could say the curvature of the Earth is captured in this photo, and that's what I really like about it. It highlights how big the city actually is. So it's not just deconstructive feedback where you're trying to change somebody's behavior to do something different or stop doing something like writing horribly. It can also apply to positive feedback as well. Now you might be thinking, in a situation where you're being positive, that it's still okay to be dispositional. And you're probably right. There's nothing wrong with tacking on a great or a nice or an awesome job onto the end of a situational assessment. But if you don't include some specifics about what it is you like, perhaps you're just being positive to be positive, which can be misleading. Perhaps the photo is not something that's good, in your opinion. Perhaps other people won't like the photo either. But by giving positive feedback without the basis of a specific situation, you might be encouraging them to create more photos like that in the future. You might encourage them to go back and look at that photo and think, wow, so people tend to like this photo. They tell me great things about it, but they didn't give me anything specific. So let me figure out what I think it is about it that they liked it. So they might be misled to find something about the photo that people really don't like simply because people are just being nice. With this in mind, when the opportunity arises to give people feedback, try to be situational, be as specific as possible. Avoid dispositional assessments. Don't tell them their work is horrible. Don't tell them great job. Or at least don't tell them great job alone. Be very specific about what it is you dislike or like. That way they understand where you're coming from, and they're less likely to take whatever it is you say as offensive or perhaps misleading.